Clara Bowen looked like a woman who had decided she could no longer afford the luxury of tears. That was Silas Vance's first thought when he saw her standing on the porch of the Bowen place. She was not staring off into the distance like a tragic figure in a painting. She was using a dull file to sharpen a rusty hoe, her movements rhythmic and hard, her shoulders set against the wind that came howling off the eastern plains. Her hands were gray with the dry dirt of the territory. Her hair, which might have been brown under the dust, was pinned up in a knot that had given up trying to hold itself together hours ago. She did not look up when Silas turned his horse into the lane, though she had undoubtedly heard the horse's shoes striking the limestone gravel a quarter-mile back. She simply kept filing, the harsh rasp of the metal cutting through the late afternoon quiet. To the people in the town of Oakhaven, Clara Bowen was a math problem that had already been solved. She was a widow with 300 acres of stubborn clay, $900 of her late husband's debt, and exactly 0 prospects of surviving the coming winter. The town merchant, the banker, and the land speculators at the saloon had already carved up her property in their minds. They were only waiting for the frost to finish her off, so they could buy the land for the price of the taxes. At least, that's what the town believed. Silas stopped his horse 10 yards from the porch. The animal was a buckskin gelding with a notched ear and a habit of sighing when he was tired, a sound that Silas often felt in his own ribs. Silas himself was 36 years old, though his face looked 45 after a decade of working other men's cattle under the high sun. He wore a canvas coat that had been patched with flour sacking at the elbow, and his boots were worn thin enough that he could feel the shape of every pebble he stepped on. He had spent the last 11 years drifting from the Brazos to the Yellowstone, never staying long enough to see the grass turn green twice in the same pasture. He was a man who had learned to live inside his own silence. The prairie has a way of measuring a man by what he leaves in the dirt, not what he carries in his pocket, and Silas had very little of either. Clara Bowen finally stopped her filing. She did not set the hoe down. She rested her hand on the top of the handle, using it like a walking stick, and looked at Silas with eyes that were a pale, tired gray. They were the eyes of someone who had spent too many nights looking at a ledger that refused to balance. "There is no work here," she said. Her voice was flat, dried out by the prairie wind. "If you are looking for a meal, there is a well behind the barn, but the bucket leaks." "I have my own water," Silas said, "and I have my own bacon." "Then you had best keep riding to where the grass is better," she said. "My husband, Thomas, died in May. He left this place with more holes in the fence than posts, and the bank has a paper that says they own the dirt if I cannot find $900 by the 1st of November. I cannot pay a hand. I cannot even pay the taxes on the house I am standing on." Silas looked past her to the barn. The roof was sagging in the middle like an old horse's back. The corral was held together with hemlock limbs and old rope. A heavy brass pocket watch with a cracked crystal sat on the windowsill just inside the kitchen window, its hands frozen at 4 minutes past 12. It had belonged to Thomas Bowen, and it had not ticked since the day they buried him under the cottonwood by the creek. "I did not ask for wages," Silas said. He swung his leg over the saddle and slid down to the ground. His knees made a small cracking sound that matched the dry timber of the porch. Clara Bowen did not move, but her grip on the hoe handle tightened until her knuckles went white. "I do not take charity from drifters, mister, especially not drifters who look like they have not had a hot meal since the centennial." "It is not charity," Silas said, taking the reins of his horse. He began to unsaddle the buckskin, his hands moving with the easy familiarity of a man who had done this 3,000 times before. "I need a place to turn my horse out where the water is sweet, and I need a roof that does not let the stars through." I can fix that fence in 3 days. After that, we can talk about the barn." "If you touch that saddle," she said, her voice rising just enough to make the buckskin twitch its ears, "I will go inside and get the Winchester. It is leaning against the door frame, and it is loaded with 44 cartridges that I bought with my last basket of eggs." Silas did not stop. He lifted the heavy stock saddle off the horse's back and set it carefully on the porch rail. He smelled of sweat, horsehair, and the dry grass of the trail. "If you shoot me, Mrs. Bowen," he said without looking at her, "you will have to drag me off the porch yourself. And then you will still have to fix that fence. The red cow has been in your clover since noon, and she is going to bloat if she stays there much longer." Clara stood very still for a long 3 seconds. Her chest rose and fell beneath her faded gingham dress. She looked at the red cow, which was indeed standing knee-deep in the small clover patch near the creek, chewing with the slow, mindless satisfaction of an animal that knew no law. Then she looked at Silas, who was already leading his horse toward the corral. She did not go for the rifle. She simply picked up her file again, but she did not use it. She watched his back as he walked away, her face expressionless, but her shoulders dropped perhaps half an inch from where they had been held all day. Respect is a quiet thing, built out of grease and sweat and the sound of 2 shovels hitting the ground at the same time. Silas did not ask for her permission again, and she did not offer her thanks. The next morning he was up before the crows had left the cottonwoods. He did not come to the house. He found a rusty spade in the lean-to and went to work on the south fence line, where the cedar posts had rotted off at the ground. By noon, he had reset 5 posts, using stones from the creek bed to pack the dirt tight. He did not have wire tensioners, so he used a hickory branch to twist the barbed wire until it hummed when the wind hit it. At 12 o'clock, Clara came down the path carrying a tin plate with 3 cold biscuits and a slice of salt pork that had been fried until it was hard as boot leather. She set the plate on a flat stump 20 yards from where he was working and walked back to the house without saying a word. Silas ate the biscuits. They were heavy, slightly burnt on the bottom, and they tasted faintly of wood smoke. They were the best thing he had eaten in 3 weeks. The second week the weather broke. A cold rain came out of the north, turning the red clay into a thick, grease-like mud that clung to Silas's boots until each foot weighed 10 pounds. It was the kind of rain that searched for every split in a seam and every hole in a roof. Silas spent 3 days on the barn roof, using split cedar shingles he had found under the hayloft. He worked with his mouth full of iron nails, his fingers so cold he could barely feel the hammer. From the kitchen window, Clara watched him. She was kneading bread, her arms dusted with white flour up to her elbows. The kitchen was cold, despite the small fire in the cook stove. She had been burning green cottonwood, which hissed and bubbled in the firebox without giving off much heat. The third member of the household was Barnaby, an ancient grey-muzzled mule that Thomas Bowen had bought from a freighter 5 years before. Barnaby was a bureaucrat in a mule's skin. He had very strict ideas about his hours of labor. At exactly 4 o'clock every afternoon, regardless of where he was or what he was pulling, Barnaby would stop, let out a long, dry bray that sounded like a rusty pump handle, and refuse to move another inch until he was unharnessed. Silas learned this on his 3rd day when he was hauling cedar logs from the creek. Barnaby stopped in the middle of the road, turned his head to look at Silas with one dark, cynical eye, and let out his 4 o'clock bray. "He is not being stubborn," Clara said, coming out to the road with an empty lard tin she was using to collect wild plums. "He is just keeping his own books. Thomas always quit at 4. Barnaby does not believe in working overtime for a widow. He has a good union," Silas said, leaning against the wagon wheel. "He is the only thing on this place that does not owe money to the Oak Haven Bank," she said. She looked down at her boots, which were split along the side and held together with a turn of wire. "I think he knows it too." She went back to her plums. Silas did not try to force the mule. He sat down on a log, took out his pocket knife, and began to whittle a new peg for the harness. He and the mule waited out the remaining 20 minutes of the hour in perfect silence, both of them staring toward the west, where the gray clouds were turning the color of wet slate. A man who has spent 10 years looking at the back of a horse's ears doesn't have many words left to waste. Silas was comfortable with the silence, but he noticed that Clara was starting to talk to him more when she brought his dinner. Not about her feelings, or her grief, or what she missed about her old life in Illinois. She talked about the price of winter wheat, the cost of salt, and the way the spring had been so dry the grass never had a chance to seed. She was a woman who had been brought up to believe that work was the only true prayer, and she was praying with everything she had left. The frost came on a Tuesday. It was a hard white frost that turned the weeds into glass and made the water in the horse trough freeze solid enough to support a stone. Silas had spent the day cleaning out the irrigation ditch that ran from the creek to the lower pasture. It was greasy, heavy work, throwing shovelfuls of black mud up onto the bank while his boots sank into the freezing water. By the time the sun went down, his legs were numb and his lower back felt like it had been beaten with a single tree. When he reached the kitchen door, he found a calf sitting on a piece of burlap by the cook stove. It was a small, black calf, not more than 2 days old, its hide damp and shivering. Clara was kneeling beside it, rubbing its ribs with a dry flour sack. "His mother left him in the draw," she said, without looking up. "She is a first-calf heifer and does not have the sense she was born with. I found him 2 hours ago. He was nearly gone." Silas set his muddy boots by the door and walked over to the stove. He knelt on the opposite side of the calf, his hands rough and red from the cold water of the ditch. He took the flour sack from her and began to rub the calf's hindquarters with long, firm strokes. "He is strong enough," Silas said, his voice quiet in the warm kitchen. "His nose is warm. That is where the life stays when they are cold." Clara did not let go of the calf. Her hand was resting on its neck, and Silas's hand was only inches away on its shoulder. It was the first time they had been this close in the 4 weeks he had been on the ranch. The room was dark, save for the orange light that flickered through the cracks in the stoveplates. The smell of cedar smoke, wet calf, and Clara's hair filled the small space between them. "Thomas was not a bad man," she said suddenly. It was the first time she had spoken her husband's name without anger or business in her tone. Silas did not stop his hands. He kept rubbing the calf's ribs, the coarse hair ticking against his palms. "No? No," she said. "He was just a small man who wanted to be big. He thought 300 acres would make him look taller to his brothers back in Indiana. He bought the land on credit, and then he bought the wagon on credit, and then he bought the plow on credit. He used to sit at that table with his pencil, writing down numbers that did not exist. He would say, 'Clara, next year we will have 40 head of 3-year-olds, and we will sell them at 5 cents, and we will build a house with 2 chimneys.' But the grass died, and the cows didn't have calves, and the only thing that grew was the interest." She stopped rubbing. Her hand stayed on the calf's neck, her fingers curling into the soft black wool. "He did not tell me about the $900, she said. "He went to town to get a pair of boots, and he had a stroke right there on the steps of the land office. When they brought him back in the wagon, he had the new boots on, but he could not speak. He just pointed at the desk. After we buried him, I found the paper. It was dated 3 days before. He had mortgaged the house to pay the interest on the land. Some people don't need a map to find where they belong, Silas said. They just need to run out of places to run. I have nowhere else to go, she said. My father has 6 daughters and a farm the size of a postage stamp in Ohio. If I go back there, I am just another mouth to feed at a table that is already too small. You are not going back, Silas said. She looked up then, her gray eyes reflecting the firelight. And what are you doing here, Silas? You are 36 years old and you have nothing but a buckskin horse and a saddle that has been sat in so long the stirrups are different lengths. Why are you fixing my fence? Silas stopped his hand on the calf's flank. He looked at the brass pocket watch on the windowsill. The cracked glass made the hands look broken, but they were still pointing to 4 minutes past 12. I was in the war, he said. Clara waited. She did not nudge him. She did not ask which side or what regiment. She simply stayed. I was in the cavalry, he said. We spent 3 years riding through places that had been burned out so bad the birds had left. After it was over, I went back to Missouri, but my father's house was gone. Not burned, just gone. The weeds had grown up through the cellar floor so high you couldn't see the stones. I started riding west because the air smelled better where there weren't so many people trying to remember what they had lost. He looked down at his hands. They were scarred across the knuckles from an old rope burn that had never healed right. I have spent 11 years looking at other men's chimneys, he said. I have branded 10,000 calves that had another man's mark on their hip. I have slept in bunkhouses where the men didn't know my middle name and I didn't know theirs. A man gets tired of having his life written down in another man's ledger. The calf let out a small wet sneeze and tried to lift its head. Clara let out a breath that was half a laugh and half a sigh. She reached down and petted the calf's nose. He is going to live, she said. He is too stubborn to die, Silas said, rising to his feet. Just like the rest of this place. He went out to the porch to wash his hands in the basin. The water was cold enough to pinch his skin, but the air felt clean and the sky was clear from horizon to horizon. The pressure arrived 3 days later in the person of Edgar Miller. Miller was the president of the Oak Haven Bank, though his main business was buying up land from people who could no longer afford the luxury of hope. He arrived in a 2-horse carriage that had been painted so black it looked like a small hearse. He wore a clean linen shirt, a wool coat that did not have any patches on the elbows, and a pair of spectacles that he kept wiping with a white handkerchief as if the dirt of the Bowen place was personally offending his eyes. He did not get down from his carriage. He stopped at the gate Silas had rebuilt the week before, looking at the fresh cedar posts with the narrow, disappointed squint of a man who had hoped to find the property in ruins. Good morning, Mrs. Bowen, Miller said as Clara came out onto the porch. Silas was standing by the corral with a pitchfork in his hand, his sleeves rolled up to his elbows. He did not move toward the carriage, but he did not go back to his work either. Mr. Miller, Clara said. I was just passing on my way to the county seat, Miller said. He had a soft, reasonable voice that made every word sound like an invitation to a funeral. I thought I would save myself a trip next month. The note is due on the 1st, as you know. $900 plus $48 of interest. I know the date, Clara said. I have had an offer from a shipman from Wyoming, Miller said, leaning his hands on the carriage rail. He is willing to take the land off our hands for the amount of the debt plus $50 for your trouble. It would allow you to live with some dignity, Mrs. Bowen. You could go back to your family in the East. There is no shame in admitting when the prairie has beaten you. Clara did not look at Silas, but her hand found the post of the porch rail and held on. The prairie has not beaten me, Mr. Miller, she said. Miller let out a short, dry chuckle that didn't go any further than his teeth. My dear woman, you have 300 acres of clay and no one to work it. You cannot plow this ground with a garden hoe. She has a hand, Silas said. He did not raise his voice, but the sound of it carried across the yard like a dry branch snapping in the woods. Miller turned his head, his spectacles catching the glare of the morning sun. "And who are you, friend?" Miller asked. "I am the man who fixed that gate you are leaning against," Silas said. He walked over to the fence, carrying the pitchfork with the easy, unhurried gait of a man who was exactly where he belonged. "And I am the man who is going to put 80 acres of winter wheat in the ground before the frost gets into the clay." Miller looked at Silas's patched coat, his thin boots, and the notched-eared horse in the corral. He did not look impressed. "A hand cannot pay a $900 note," Mr. Miller said. "The bank does not take cedar posts or clean ditches in place of gold." "We will have the money," Clara said. Miller's face went hard. The soft, reasonable tone disappeared, replaced by the flat, cold look of a man who was used to getting his way. "On the first, Mrs. Bowen," he said. "Not the second. At 4 o'clock, the bank closes its doors and the papers will be signed over to the county sheriff. I suggest you think about the sheepman's offer. $50 will buy a very nice rail ticket back to Indiana." He gathered his reins and turned his carriage around, the iron tires grinding into the gravel Silas had laid down. Silas watched him go until the black carriage was nothing but a speck of dust on the road to the county seat. Then he turned to Clara. "We are $80 short," she said. Her voice was trembling, though her face was still set like stone. "I have sold the chickens, the 3 steers, and the wild plums. I have $600 from Thomas's life insurance that the company finally paid. And I have $80 from the wool we sheared in June. But we are $80 short, Silas." Silas did not say anything. He walked back to the barn, his boots making a dry, crunching sound on the frozen dirt. The next morning, Silas did not go to the ditch line. He saddled the buckskin horse and rode into town. He was gone for 6 hours. When he came back, he was walking. He was leading the buckskin, which had nothing on its back but a halter made of old hemp rope. Silas was carrying his saddle on his left shoulder, the stirrups clinking against his ribs as he walked. He had his canvas bag in his right hand. He did not stop at the corral. He walked straight up the path to the house, set his saddle on the porch with a heavy, hollow thud, and knocked on the door. Clara opened it. She looked at the saddle, then at Silas, then down the road where the buckskin was standing by the gate, looking back toward the town with a puzzled twitch of its notched ear. "What did you do?" she asked. "I sold him," Silas said. "To whom?" "To the liveryman," Silas said. "He is a good horse. He is 10 years old, but he has no vice and his feet are good. The liveryman gave me $85 for him and the saddle. He's going to use him for the stage line to the railhead." Clara looked at him, her eyes wide and dark in the dim light of the hallway. "That was your horse, Silas." "He was a horse," Silas said. "He was just a horse. I have had 20 of them in my life, and none of them ever did anything for me but carry me to the next place where I had to find a job." "You cannot work without a horse," she said. "I have Barnaby," Silas said. "He has a very good understanding of the hours of labor on this place." She stood in the doorway, her hand on the latch, her breath coming in short, uneven gasps. "The hardest thing about carrying a heavy load alone is the moment someone offers to help you hold the other end." "Why?" she whispered. Silas did not answer her right away. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small, heavy object wrapped in a piece of oiled flannel. He set it on the porch railing and unwrapped it. It was the brass pocket watch. It was clean now, the grease and dirt of 10 years of Thomas Bowen's pocket gone from the hinges. Silas had replaced the cracked crystal with a piece of clear glass he had cut from an old bottle, and the heavy tick of the mechanism was loud in the quiet afternoon air. Tick, tick, tick. "I fixed it," Silas said. "It was just a broken spring. It did not need a new watch. It just needed someone to take the dirt out of the wheels." He looked at her, his face plain and weathered, his grey eyes steady under his hat brim. "We are going to town tomorrow, Mrs. Bowen," he said. "We are going to pay Edgar Miller his $900, and then we are going to buy a sack of flour and 3 pounds of coffee. And then we are going to come back here and we are going to plough the South 40. Clara looked at the watch, its second hand moving with a slow, steady certainty that had nothing to do with the bank or the weather or the sheep man from Wyoming. Then she looked up at Silas. "My husband left me the debt and the land," she said. Silas did not take his eyes off her face. "Then we will work it together," he said. There was a long silence between them. It was not the silence of two people who had nothing to say, but the silence of two people who had finally found the place where the road ended and the work began. Clara reached out and picked up the watch. She held it in both hands, her fingers wrapping around the warm brass as if it were a small, live thing. "Supper is at 6, she said. Her voice was steady now, her shoulders back where they belonged. "We don't wait for the mule." The 1st of November was a Friday. They rode into Oak Haven in the lumber wagon, Silas driving the team and Clara sitting beside him on the board seat, wearing her Sunday shawl and her wire-mended boots. They did not look like people who were about to lose their home. They looked like people who had come to buy the town and were only waiting for the stores to open. Edgar Miller was sitting behind his mahogany desk when they entered the bank. He had the papers already laid out on the blotter, his gold pen resting in its stand like a tiny pointed spear. "You are early, Mrs. Bowen," Miller said, looking at his pocket watch. It was 10 minutes before 12. "The road was dry," Clara said. She did not sit down in the chair he offered. She stood at the counter, her purse in her hand, while Silas stood half a step behind her, his canvas coat clean and his hat in his hand. Miller looked at Silas, then down at the table. "I assume you have come to sign the papers for the sheep man. I have them right here." Clara did not answer. She reached into her purse and began to lay the money on the counter. First came the gold coins, $10 pieces that had been saved in a large tin under the floorboards for 5 years, their faces dull and scratched from the grease. Then came the paper bills, worn thin and soft as cloth from being folded into too many pockets. Finally, she laid down 4 $20 gold pieces that Silas had brought back from the livery stable, their edges bright and sharp in the dim light of the bank office. $948, Clara said. Miller did not touch the money. He looked at it as if it were a collection of dead leaves that had blown in through the door. "This is highly irregular," he said. "The note is paid, Mr. Miller," Clara said. She took the receipt book from her purse and pushed it across the counter. "Sign the paper." Miller looked at Silas. Silas did not say anything. He simply stood there, his shoulder resting against the doorframe, his hand resting on the hilt of his pocket knife. He did not look angry. He looked like a man who had all day, and the next 10 years, to wait for her to finish her business. Miller picked up the pen. He signed his name with 3 quick, sharp strokes that looked like he was trying to cut the paper. "You are a foolish woman, Mrs. Bowen," Miller said as he handed her the receipt. "You have saved the land, but you have no horse, no seed, and no way to make a crop. You will be back here in the spring, and the interest will be higher then. We have the seed, Silas said. It was the first time he had spoken since they entered the bank. And we have the team. What team? Miller asked, looking out the window at the lumber wagon. Barnaby, Silas said. And me. They walked out of the bank together, the heavy glass doors swinging shut behind them with a solid, respectable thud. The town of Oak Haven was still there, its wooden sidewalks gray under the autumn sun, but it looked different to Silas now. It looked like a place he was passing through on his way home. They bought the flour, the coffee, and a box of salt from the mercantile. The storekeeper, Mrs. Gable, tried to ask 3 different questions about Silas's saddle, which she had seen at the livery stable, but Clara ignored her with the practiced ease of a woman who had spent 5 years learning how to keep her own business inside her own teeth. By the time they reached the Bowen Lane, the sun was low in the west, turning the red clay of the road the color of old copper. Silas stopped the wagon at the gate. He got down to open it, his boots sinking into the gravel he had laid down. He looked at the gate posts, which were straight and solid in the red earth. The sign was still there, but it was different now. Clara had taken her husband's name off the board that hung from the crossbar. She had used a piece of charcoal from the cook stove to write 2 names on the clean wood, her letters large and round and easy to read from the road. Bowen and Vance. Silas stood by the gate for a long minute, looking at the letters. The wind was coming out of the north again, cold and sharp, with the scent of the coming snow, but he did not feel it. "You are going to freeze standing there, Silas," Clara called from the wagon. Silas closed the gate and climbed back up onto the seat beside her. He took the reins from her hands, his fingers brushing hers as he did. "It is going to be a hard winter," he said. "I have 6 cords of oak behind the house," she said, "and the roof doesn't leak." Silas shook the reins, and Barnaby started up the lane, his long ears flopping in time with his slow, deliberate walk. He did not bray, though it was nearly 4 o'clock, and he knew exactly how much farther he had to go before he could stop. You don't always know the moment when the drifting ends. Sometimes you only know it looking back. But it ends.